My son asked me why I hated God, and that question broke me. Ex-Atheist Testimony. Before you hear my testimony, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, so we can see how far this story of hope has reached. I used to wear my atheism like a badge of honor. Whenever someone asked me about faith, I would answer quickly, with a tone of superiority, that I had no need for God. To me, belief was just a crutch for weak minds, an outdated system for people who couldn't handle reality. I loved to describe myself as rational, logical, and enlightened. Whenever debates about religion came up at work or among friends, I would sit taller, ready to dismiss everything with sharp arguments. It gave me a sense of power, of being above the rest. Deep down, it wasn't just disbelief, it was pride, and I relished in the identity I had created. I had read countless books by skeptics and philosophers who denied God. Their words became my armor, and I carried them everywhere. If someone quoted scripture, I had a counterpoint ready. If someone spoke of miracles, I laughed and listed scientific explanations. Over time, I began to believe I was smarter than the average believer. I saw myself as someone who had escaped indoctrination, as if I alone had unlocked some secret truth that the rest of the world was too blind to see. That arrogance gave me fuel. I mocked, I dismissed, and I felt justified in it all. This pride didn't just stay in debates, it seeped into how I lived. When life was good, I claimed it was my effort alone. When challenges came, I pushed harder and said it was proof that I didn't need anyone's help. Certainly not a God in the sky. My sense of self was built on independence. I thought faith was a weakness, and I wanted nothing to do with weakness. To admit a need for God felt like surrender, and surrender was something I promised myself I would never do. My entire worldview was shaped by this determination to rely on myself alone. I remember walking into churches only for weddings or funerals, and every time I stepped inside, I rolled my eyes at the rituals. I watched people bow their heads and close their eyes, whispering prayers, and I felt nothing but pity for them. I thought, how sad to waste your time talking to the ceiling. I would smirk, sometimes even making jokes under my breath. To me, those moments were proof of my own intellectual superiority. I believed I had outgrown what I considered fairy tales, and I convinced myself that was the only respectable way to live. The pride I carried wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional. I loved feeling in control. Whenever someone spoke about surrendering to God, I thought, why surrender when you can master your own destiny? That phrase, master of my own destiny, was like a mantra for me. I repeated it often, even teaching my son to believe that life was about strength, logic, and control. Faith, in my mind, was the language of cowards. It didn't occur to me that my so-called strength was only masking a heart that was already fragile. I built walls around myself and convinced myself those walls made me strong. Even when people around me shared personal testimonies of faith, I dismissed them as delusions. A friend once told me how prayer had changed his life, and I laughed in his face. I said, that's just coincidence. You give credit to a God who doesn't exist because you can't handle reality. He looked at me with sadness, but I ignored it. I thought I was helping people by tearing down their illusions, by waking them up to what I saw as truth. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't saving anyone. I was only hardening my own heart, brick by brick. The deeper my pride grew, the more I distanced myself from anything spiritual. I avoided conversations that might challenge me. If a family member brought up church, I quickly changed the subject. If I passed by a Bible on someone's table, I scoffed internally. I thought ignoring it all was proof of strength, but in reality, it was fear. Pride and fear often work together, and I didn't see it then. I was terrified of being wrong, terrified that I might not be as in control as I claimed. So I doubled down again and again on my identity as an atheist. Looking back, I can see that my atheism wasn't just disbelief, it was rebellion. I wasn't neutral, I was actively against God. I enjoyed arguing, debating, and tearing down. It gave me a sense of importance, but under all the clever words, under all the confidence, there was a small voice I tried to silence. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I sometimes wondered, what if I'm wrong? But the next morning, pride always drowned out that voice. I couldn't admit weakness, not even to myself. So I lived as if I was unshakable, convincing everyone, including me, that I was secure. In conversations with my son, I often repeated my philosophy. I wanted him to grow up strong, logical, and free from illusions. I taught him that faith was for the weak and that we didn't need it. I thought I was giving him the gift of reason, but in truth, I was passing on my arrogance and emptiness. He listened, he absorbed, and I felt proud that he was becoming like me. I didn't know then that one innocent question from him would one day shatter the foundation of everything I built. At that time, I thought I had won. I thought I had figured life out. But pride is a dangerous master. It blinds you to your flaws. It convinces you that you are strong when you are actually fragile, and it leads you further into darkness while making you believe you are in the light. I lived in that blindness for years. Too proud to see my need, too arrogant to recognize my own pain. I carried myself as a man who had no need for God. But the truth was the opposite. I was desperately empty. My pride was the mask that kept me from facing the truth, and it would take the innocent words of a child to finally crack it open. From as far back as I can remember, I carried a sharp tongue whenever the topic of faith came up. Even as a teenager, I would roll my eyes at classmates who prayed before exams, muttering under my breath that they were wasting their time. I mocked them loudly enough so others would laugh, and for me it felt like a small victory every time I got a chuckle at their expense. I enjoyed the role of the skeptic, the one who shattered illusions. To me, believers weren't just wrong, they were weak, and I wanted everyone to know that I was stronger than that. I took pride in calling Christians dependent on a sky daddy, as I used to say with venom in my voice. Whenever I passed by a church and saw people walking out with smiles, I scoffed and thought, they need this fantasy to survive, but I'm free from it. This sense of superiority filled me with arrogance, and I thought it was intelligence. I believed mocking faith made me clever, and the laughter of my peers was the applause I craved. My ridicule wasn't casual. It was deliberate, almost like a mission to tear down what others held sacred. My favorite pastime was engaging in debates, not to learn, but to humiliate. I would interrupt people mid-sentence, point out contradictions, and raise my voice until they had no response. Then I'd smirk and say, "See, you have nothing." I wasn't searching for truth. I was searching for dominance. Faith was my favorite target because I saw it as an easy opponent. I thought, how could anyone defend something invisible? For me, every debate was a stage, and every believer was someone to be ridiculed for my entertainment. Even at family gatherings, I couldn't resist. When an older relative said grace at the table, I sighed loudly or made sarcastic comments. If someone thanked God for their health, I would laugh and credit science or luck. My words stung, but I didn't care. I told myself it was honesty, but really, it was cruelty. I mocked because it made me feel bigger, and belittling others gave me a twisted sense of victory. At the time, I never saw the damage I caused. I thought I was enlightening people, when all I was doing was hardening my own heart. In school, I gained a reputation for being outspoken against religion. Teachers would sometimes ask for respectful discussions, but I rarely held back. I loved calling faith a crutch for the weak-minded and made it my mission to point out hypocrisy whenever I could. If a Christian classmate stumbled morally, I was the first to announce, "See, your God didn't help you." To me, that was evidence enough. I didn't notice that my bitterness was poisoning me. I only noticed how satisfying it was to laugh at someone else's belief. The ridicule followed me into adulthood. In the workplace, whenever colleagues spoke of church or shared something spiritual, I quickly cut in with mockery. I thought it made me stand out as bold and courageous. In reality, it only isolated me from people who once tried to be close. My words built walls, and I didn't mind. I told myself, better to stand alone with reason than together with fools who believe in fairy tales. That motto echoed in my head constantly, reinforcing my disdain for anything tied to God. I even mocked faith in entertainment. When I saw religious movies or heard Christian songs, I rolled my eyes and made sarcastic remarks. I dismissed them as manipulative tools for the ignorant. I prided myself on avoiding such nonsense, believing it made me cultured and enlightened. I thought my rejection of these things was proof of my freedom. What I didn't realize was that the constant need to mock revealed a deep unrest in me. I couldn't just ignore faith. I had to attack it. That obsession hinted that faith was not as irrelevant to me as I claimed. I thought I was untouchable, above the need for faith. But the truth is, I couldn't stand seeing people believe in something I had rejected. Their peace unsettled me, their hope annoyed me, and their prayers irritated me. Deep down, I was jealous of the comfort they seemed to have. But instead of admitting envy, I covered it with ridicule. I sharpened my sarcasm like a weapon, hoping it would keep me from feeling my own emptiness. I convinced myself that mocking faith was power, when in truth, it was weakness disguised as confidence. My friends and I even made games out of it. We would watch preachers online and laugh at their sermons, mimicking their voices and gestures. I would crack jokes about how gullible people must be to give money to churches or to pray for miracles. We thought we were smarter, sharper, and braver than everyone else, but laughter became my shield, and behind that shield was a heart that was increasingly bitter. I didn't realize it then, but my constant mocking was not strength. It was evidence of a deep war inside my soul. For years, mocking faith was my identity. It was how I defined myself to others and how I measured my own worth. I felt powerful, tearing others down, but that power was shallow. It left me more hollow each time. What I couldn't see back then was that my ridicule wasn't hurting God, it was hurting me. Every joke, every insult, every smirk only built higher walls around my heart. I thought I was free, but I was becoming enslaved to bitterness. And though I didn't know it yet, those walls I built would one day come crashing down with a single, unexpected question. When I got married, I promised myself one thing above all. My family would be built on reason, not faith. I carried the same arrogance into my marriage that had defined my youth. My wife wasn't religious either, which only strengthened my resolve. We agreed early on that our household would be free from prayers, churches, or any mention of God. To me, that felt like a victory, like I was protecting the future from the same illusions I had once mocked in others. I told myself that our home would be one of logic and truth, untouched by superstition. When our son was born, I felt a sense of pride unlike anything I had ever known. I held him in my arms and thought, he will grow up smarter than the rest. He will never waste time believing in fairy tales. I imagined him asking deep questions about the universe, and me providing him with rational answers rooted in science and facts. I thought raising him without God would give him strength, independence, and clarity. I told myself I was saving him from the same delusions that I believed weakened so many others. It felt noble, even righteous, in my own twisted way. I made it clear from the beginning, no prayers before meals, no bedtime stories about God, no church visits. Instead, I filled his world with books, documentaries, and science experiments. I wanted him to grow up with curiosity, not devotion. I told myself that every parent tries to pass on their values, and mine just happened to be rooted in reason. I considered myself a better father for sparing him what I called the chains of religion. Looking back now, I realize how much pride was wrapped up in that decision, but at the time, I saw only wisdom. Whenever relatives suggested baptism or mentioned God in conversation, I quickly shut it down. I said things like, "We don't do that in this house," or "He doesn't need fairy tales, he needs facts." My firmness often offended family members, but I didn't care. In fact, I took their discomfort as proof that I was standing for something noble. I wore my resistance to religion as a badge of honor. I thought I was shielding my son from manipulation. In reality, I was planting seeds of bitterness and arrogance in him, the same seeds I had carried all my life. As he grew, I encouraged him to ask questions, but only within the framework of science. If he asked, "Where do people go when they die?" I would say, "Nowhere. They just stop existing." If he asked about miracles, I laughed and explained they were coincidences or tricks. I thought I was giving him clarity, but often I noticed a shadow of disappointment in his eyes, as if he wanted something more. Still, I ignored it, convinced that one day he would thank me for raising him free of religion. I believed I was doing the noble work of saving him. We raised him to be skeptical of anyone who claimed to hear from God. I told him stories of religious scandals, corrupt leaders, and broken promises, using them as ammunition to prove my point. I thought that by highlighting hypocrisy, I was showing him the truth. At bedtime, instead of prayers, we read books about planets, history, or philosophy. I wanted him to be enlightened, not brainwashed. Yet deep inside, there were nights when I wondered if I was taking something away from him, something I couldn't name but could sense lingering in his heart. Holidays were stripped of their religious meaning. Christmas was about gifts and family gatherings, not about Christ. Easter was about candy and games, not resurrection. I thought this was progress, a modern way of living. I prided myself on raising a child who would never bow his head in prayer. I thought he would thank me for keeping his mind sharp and his heart free from myths. But sometimes, when I saw other children praying with their families, I noticed a quiet curiosity in his eyes. I dismissed it quickly, assuring myself it was nothing. I believed love alone was enough. As long as I provide for him, protect him, and teach him to think critically, that's all that matters, I said often. My love was real, but it was incomplete. I didn't realize that denying him faith meant denying him hope beyond this world. My version of love was bound to the limits of human strength, and though I didn't see it then, it wasn't enough to fill the questions in his little heart. I told myself I was giving him freedom, but I was only giving him walls, the same walls I had built for myself. There were moments when he asked about God directly, usually after hearing something at school or from neighbors. "Dad, is God real?" he asked once. My response was sharp. "No, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I thought I was protecting him, but the look on his face told another story. It wasn't relief. It was confusion, maybe even sadness. I brushed it off, believing that he would grow out of such questions. I didn't realize that my determination to erase God from his world was shaping more than his mind. It was shaping his soul. I wore my decision like armor. I was the father raising a child free of delusion. I told myself I was courageous, standing against tradition, breaking cycles. But the truth was that I was raising my son in the same bitterness that consumed me. I believed I was giving him strength, but I was passing on emptiness. And while I didn't know it then, the very child I thought I was protecting would one day ask a single question that pierced through all my arrogance and shattered the foundation I had built for our family without God. Outwardly, I presented myself as a man of confidence, a father who had everything under control. People often said I was rational, steady, someone who had figured life out without the need for religion. I enjoyed that reputation and carried it proudly, as if my lack of faith made me stronger than others. But deep inside, when the noise of the world faded and I was left alone with my thoughts, I felt something gnawing at me. It was like a shadow in my chest, a weight I couldn't shake. I had all the answers, yet I still felt empty. I buried that emptiness beneath work, responsibilities, and achievements. If I could climb the next step in my career, provide more for my family, and appear successful, maybe that void would stay hidden. I worked long hours, convinced myself I was building a secure future, and told my wife and son that love and reason were enough. But in quiet moments, when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't deny the truth. Nothing I achieved ever felt like enough. The satisfaction faded quickly, and the emptiness only grew heavier. I told myself it was just part of being human, that everyone felt restless sometimes. But when I looked around, I noticed something that bothered me deeply. Friends who had faith seemed to have a peace I couldn't explain. Even in their struggles, there was a calmness in them that I lacked. I mocked them publicly, of course, but privately, it disturbed me. How could people who believed in fairy tales walk with more peace than I, the one who claimed to have the truth? It didn't make sense, and it planted questions I refused to face. To silence those questions, I filled my life with noise. I turned to entertainment, distractions, anything that kept my mind from drifting toward the void I carried. Nights were the hardest. When the house was quiet and I saw my son sleeping peacefully, I felt an ache I couldn't name. It was as if something was missing, something vital, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I told myself it was exhaustion or the pressure of being a father, but the truth was simpler. I was missing peace. I was missing meaning. I tried to convince myself that love for my family was enough to fill the void. And for brief moments, it almost worked. Playing with my son, holding him close, sharing laughter. Those moments brought joy. But even then, there was a shadow behind the joy. A voice whispered, "What happens when this is gone? What happens when life ends?" I silenced that voice quickly, but it lingered, haunting me when I least expected it. The love I had was real, but it wasn't eternal, and deep down, I knew it. That truth gnawed at me. I avoided conversations about death like the plague. Whenever my son asked innocent questions like, "Dad, what happens when we die?" I answered sharply, cutting the topic short. I told him, "Nothing happens, life just ends," as if that solved the problem. But after saying those words, the weight in my chest grew heavier. If I was so certain, why did the question leave me restless? Why did I feel like I was lying? Not just to him, but to myself. I was proud of my disbelief, but behind the pride lived fear, and I couldn't escape it. There were times I even envied believers, though I'd never admit it out loud. I saw how their faith gave them comfort in loss, hope in trials, and strength in weakness. I dismissed it as illusion, but part of me wondered what it would feel like to carry that kind of peace. I imagined how different my nights would be if I truly believed in something beyond myself. But I pushed those thoughts away as quickly as they came. Admitting envy meant admitting weakness, and I refused to see myself as weak. So the emptiness remained, hidden but alive. I became skilled at pretending. To my wife, I was the strong, confident husband. To my son, I was the wise, rational father. To friends, I was the bold skeptic who never wavered. But when I was alone, none of those masks could silence the truth. I was tired of pretending I had it all together, tired of mocking others just to cover my own insecurity, tired of carrying a weight I couldn't name. I lived with a contradiction. I proclaimed freedom, yet I felt chained inside. My heart longed for something I refused to acknowledge. The emptiness began to show in subtle ways. I was quick to anger, impatient, restless, always chasing something new to distract me. My wife noticed it, though she rarely said anything. My son noticed too, asking sometimes, "Dad, are you okay?" I would brush it off with a smile, but his innocent eyes seemed to see right through me. The irony was painful. I thought I was protecting him from lies, but he was the one quietly recognizing that I was the one living in denial. He sensed the hollowness that I tried so hard to hide. Looking back, I see that emptiness as God's whisper. At the time, though, I saw it only as frustration, something I needed to fight or cover up. I didn't realize that the void was pointing me toward him, that the weight I carried was a symptom of my soul's hunger. I thought I could silence it with reason, love, or success, but nothing worked. The truth was simple, but I refused to see it. I was empty because I was far from the one who could fill me. That emptiness, though I tried to bury it, was slowly breaking me from within. At home, I often spoke against God without even realizing the weight of my words. It was so natural for me to mock faith that I didn't think twice about doing it in front of my family. I believed I was giving my son clarity, saving him from illusions that I considered dangerous. I thought I was protecting him by arming him with skepticism, teaching him to laugh at what others revered. But slowly, I began to notice something unsettling. My son, still so small and impressionable, started repeating some of the same phrases I used. At first, I felt proud. When I heard him echo my words, I thought, good. He's learning early. He won't be deceived like so many others. I mistook his repetition as evidence that I was raising him well. When he laughed at people who prayed or called them weak, I smiled, thinking I was passing on strength. I never considered the possibility that I was planting seeds of bitterness in a heart too tender to carry them. He was copying me, yes, but he wasn't just learning reason. He was learning contempt, and I was blind to it. One day, he came home from school and told me he had argued with another child. The boy had spoken about God, and my son had mocked him, saying, "That's just stories for weak people." I felt a twisted sense of victory in that moment, as though my worldview was spreading to the next generation. But later that night, when the house grew quiet, the memory troubled me. I realized he was only repeating what I'd poured into him. My son wasn't forming his own convictions. He was just imitating my voice, my sarcasm, my disdain. I began to notice the sharpness in his words whenever the subject of God came up. It wasn't just innocent questioning. It was ridicule, laced with the same pride I carried. He was too young to truly understand what he was saying, but he repeated it with passion because he wanted to be like me. And suddenly, I saw myself in him, not the strong, rational man I pretended to be, but the angry, mocking skeptic who used scorn as a shield. My son was becoming a mirror of my unbelief, and it unsettled me deeply. There were moments when my wife looked at me with quiet worry. She didn't always challenge me, but her eyes spoke volumes. I could tell she wondered if I was leading our child down a dangerous path. Once, she asked gently, "Do you think it's good for him to talk that way?" I brushed off her concern with arrogance, insisting that we were saving him from lies. But later, her question echoed in my mind. What if I wasn't saving him at all? What if I was robbing him of something he desperately needed? Children learn not just from what we say, but from the spirit behind our words. My son wasn't simply learning to reject God. He was learning to mock, to belittle, to carry pride instead of humility. And I couldn't ignore the truth. I had given him those tools. I thought I was raising him to be strong, but in reality, I was handing him my emptiness disguised as strength. He carried my phrases, my tone, my disdain, and it was shaping his character more than I realized. My influence was stronger than I had ever imagined. The more he grew, the more I saw my own reflection in him. He had my stubbornness, my sarcasm, and even my restless questions. But instead of pride, I began to feel fear. What if he inherited not just my words, but my emptiness? What if he carried the same hollow heart that haunted me at night? The thought terrified me. I wanted better for him, even though I didn't know how to provide it. I didn't want him to feel the same void I carried, yet I was the one teaching him to embrace it. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I wondered how different he would be if I had spoken words of faith instead of scorn. What if he had grown up hearing that there was hope beyond this life, that love had a greater source than just human effort? Would his eyes shine with more peace? Would his laughter be freer, untainted by the sharpness of mockery? These questions haunted me, but instead of changing, I hid behind my pride, convincing myself that I was right. I feared the consequences of admitting that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. One particular evening stays burned in my memory. My son repeated one of my harshest statements in front of his grandmother, a woman of quiet faith. He said with boldness, "Only fools believe in God." The room went silent. My mother looked at me with sadness, and my wife lowered her eyes. In that instant, I felt shame. I had taught him those words, and now they were being spoken to someone who loved us, someone who prayed for us. The echo of my own voice in my son's mouth pierced me in a way I couldn't shake. Looking back, I see that my influence was far greater than I realized. I thought I was shaping his mind with reason, but I was shaping his heart with pride. I thought I was giving him freedom, but I was chaining him to my emptiness. Children don't just absorb arguments, they absorb spirit. And I had given him a spirit of mockery, of doubt, of coldness. I had passed down not strength, but a wound disguised as wisdom. The truth terrified me then, and it terrifies me now. The first altar my son ever saw was the altar of my unbelief. It was an ordinary night, one of those evenings that seemed no different from countless others. The house was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp in the living room. I remember the air felt heavy, as if silence itself carried weight. My son and I had just argued about something small, a trivial disagreement that escalated because of my short temper. He had wanted to stay up late, and I insisted he go to bed. But beneath the surface, the tension wasn't about bedtime. It was about the growing wall between us, a wall I myself had built. I sat in my chair, pretending to read, while he sulked nearby. I tried to act as though I didn't care, but inside I felt the sting of guilt. I could hear him shifting uncomfortably, restless, unwilling to let the night end in silence. And then, unexpectedly, he spoke. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, yet it cut through the stillness of the room like a blade. "Dad," he said, "why do you hate God so much?" Those words froze me in place. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. But when I looked at his face, I saw seriousness in his eyes. It wasn't the question itself that stunned me, it was the way he asked it. There was no mockery in his tone, no echo of the scorn he had learned from me. Instead, there was curiosity, even pain, as though he carried a weight he couldn't explain. My son, the very child I had raised to reject faith, was now asking me a question that went beyond arguments. He wanted to know not just my reasoning, but my heart. And in that moment I realized I had no simple answer. My hatred was louder than my logic. I opened my mouth, ready to respond with the usual cliches. I wanted to tell him that faith was a crutch, that belief in God was for the weak. I wanted to arm him again with my proud defiance, but as I looked at him, something stopped me. The words that had always come so easily now felt hollow, empty, like smoke in the air. I saw the longing in his eyes, the desire for something more than explanations. He wasn't looking for a debate. He was looking for truth, for love, for hope. And I realized I couldn't give it to him. My chest tightened as silence stretched between us. I had built my life around rejecting God, mocking faith, and shielding myself with pride. But in that one question, my son had exposed the fragility of it all. Why did I hate God? I didn't even know anymore. Was it because of past pain, because of unanswered questions? Or was it because hating him felt safer than admitting I might need him? These thoughts swirled in my mind, and I felt suddenly small, smaller than I had ever felt in my life. My son waited patiently, his eyes locked on mine. He wasn't challenging me, he was inviting me to open up, to speak honestly, to confront the truth I had buried beneath years of sarcasm and anger. For the first time, I felt the weight of my responsibility, not just as a father, but as a man. He was looking to me for answers, and I had none. The bitterness I had passed down to him suddenly looked like poison, and I realized I was feeding it to someone I loved more than myself. The question echoed in my head long after it left his lips. Why do you hate God? It was as if he had held up a mirror to my soul, showing me the emptiness I had tried so hard to ignore. I wanted to brush it off, to laugh it away, but I couldn't. The sincerity in his voice had broken through my defenses. For years I had mocked faith without hesitation, but now I was the one being challenged, and not by a preacher or a believer, but by my own child. Finally, I managed to whisper something, though my words were shaky. "I don't hate him," I said, though even I didn't believe it. My son tilted his head, studying me as if he could see straight through the facade, and in that moment I knew I was lying, not just to him but to myself. Deep inside there was anger, resentment, a grudge I had carried against God without even fully understanding why. My son's simple question had uncovered a truth I couldn't hide anymore. That night I lay in bed unable to sleep. His words haunted me, playing over and over in my mind. It wasn't just a child's innocent curiosity, it was a piercing truth wrapped in a question. Why did I hate God? The more I thought about it, the less I could justify my hostility. I had built my identity around disbelief, but now it felt shaky, fragile, even dishonest. My son had shaken the foundation of my unbelief, and I didn't know how to rebuild. Looking back, I see that it was no ordinary night. It was the beginning of a breaking point, the moment when the cracks in my armor became impossible to ignore. My son's question wasn't just for me, it was for my soul. It forced me to confront the hatred I had disguised as reason, the emptiness I had called freedom. That night, in the quiet of our home, I realized something terrifying and liberating all at once. My son had asked the question that God himself had been whispering into my heart for years. Dad, why do you hate God? The words fell from his lips with such innocence that they struck me harder than any insult, harder than any debate I had ever been part of. It wasn't the tone of accusation or rebellion. It was the gentle sincerity of a child who genuinely wanted to understand his father's heart. In that instant, I felt my chest tighten, as though all the air had been pulled from the room. It was a simple question, yet it echoed louder than every argument I had ever used against faith. I sat there in silence, unable to respond. My mind raced, searching for the rehearsed answers I had carried for years. Religion is a crutch. Faith is an illusion. Science explains everything. Those words had always come so quickly to me, like weapons sharpened for battle. But in that moment they felt lifeless, empty, and brittle. They couldn't stand against the purity in his eyes. He wasn't asking for a debate. He was asking for truth. And I realized with horror that I had none to give. The innocence of his question disarmed me. It bypassed the armor of intellect and struck straight into the core of my soul. Why did I hate God? Was it because of childhood experiences, unanswered prayers, or pain I had buried? I didn't know. I only knew that I had carried this hatred like a shield, protecting myself from something I couldn't name. But now, standing before the gaze of my son, the shield felt heavy, unnecessary, and even destructive. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and ashamed. He continued to look at me, waiting. There was no judgment in his eyes, only curiosity and perhaps a subtle sadness. It was as though he had seen through me, recognizing that the man who claimed to have all the answers was lost in his own emptiness. His little question became a mirror, reflecting back the hollowness of my convictions. I realized for the first time that my son wasn't just imitating my disbelief. He was questioning it, testing its weight, and discovering its cracks. I wanted to dismiss him with a laugh, to wave the question away as if it didn't matter. But I couldn't. Something inside me broke. I felt the sting of tears pressing against my eyes, though I fought to hold them back. I had always prided myself on strength, on control, on the superiority of reason over faith. Yet here I was, undone by the soft voice of my child. I had built a fortress of skepticism, but with one sentence, my son had shaken its walls. That night, I wrestled with the words. I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing his voice. Dad, why do you hate God? It repeated endlessly in my mind, haunting me like a melody I couldn't escape. I realized I had spent years ridiculing believers, scoffing at their prayers, and mocking their hope. But never once had I stopped to ask myself why my rejection of God was so intense, so personal. His question forced me to confront the possibility that my hatred wasn't intellectual. It was emotional, born out of wounds I hadn't acknowledged. I began to see the irony. I had claimed to live free of faith, free of God, free of superstition. Yet the moment my son asked that question, I realized how bound I truly was. Bound by anger, by resentment, by bitterness I couldn't explain. My so-called freedom was nothing more than another kind of prison. And the bars of that prison became visible only because a child dared to ask me something no adult ever had. His innocence exposed my chains. I looked at him differently after that. He wasn't just a child parroting my words, he was searching, and in his searching he revealed the hypocrisy of my stance. How could I teach him to despise God when I didn't even know why I did? How could I claim to be rational when I had never examined the roots of my hatred? For the first time, I saw the danger of my influence. I wasn't raising him in truth, I was raising him in the shadow of my bitterness. The weight of that realization crushed me. I thought I was giving him clarity, protecting him from illusions, but maybe I was only passing down my emptiness. Maybe the very thing I wanted to shield him from, blind faith, was less dangerous than the blind hatred I had modeled. His question revealed something terrifying. I had nothing solid to pass down, nothing that could fill the void in his heart or mine. I had mocked God for years, but now I was afraid of what life without him truly meant. Looking back, I know that moment was a turning point. My son's innocent question became the spark that cracked the foundation of my unbelief. It wasn't a sermon, a book, or a debate that pierced my defenses. It was the voice of my child, untainted by pride, asking what my heart had tried to ignore. That question lingered, echoing louder than any argument. And though I didn't know it then, it was the beginning of a journey I could never have imagined. A journey back to the very God I claimed to hate. The moment my son asked me why I hated God, I froze. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for an answer. But nothing came out of my mouth. My lips parted slightly, but the words died before they could form. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument I had ever had. Heavier than all the debates I used to win with sharp logic. It was the kind of silence that exposes you, strips away your defenses, and forces you to face yourself. I tried to hold his gaze, but I couldn't. My eyes shifted away, wandering toward the floor, the walls, anywhere but his face. Yet the silence wouldn't let me escape. It pressed down like a weight on my chest, suffocating me with truths I didn't want to acknowledge. I had been so quick to laugh at believers, so quick to mock and dismiss their faith. But now, when my own son sought an explanation, I had nothing. My intellectual pride suddenly seemed so small, so flimsy. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. My silence was louder than any words I could have spoken. My son didn't need a lecture to understand what it meant. He saw it. He saw the emptiness, the hesitation, the fear. He saw that beneath all my confidence and bravado, I was lost. I wasn't the strong, logical man I pretended to be. I was just a father with no real answers, clinging to my disbelief like a drowning man clings to driftwood. I thought about breaking the silence with something clever, something dismissive to shut the conversation down. I could have told him not to ask silly questions. I could have ridiculed the idea of God again, tried to laugh it off. But for the first time, I couldn't. The words felt poisonous on my tongue, and I couldn't bring myself to speak them. The silence held me captive, demanding honesty, demanding that I face the hollowness of my own heart. My son tilted his head slightly, as though trying to read my mind. He didn't press me, didn't repeat the question. He just waited. And in that waiting, I felt exposed. The innocence of his patience was more powerful than any argument. It was as if God himself had chosen that moment to confront me, not with thunder or fire, but through the quiet persistence of a child's question that I couldn't answer. I wanted desperately to break free, to say anything that would lift the tension. But the more I struggled internally, the more I realized I was powerless. My silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was revealing. It revealed the cracks in my disbelief, the doubt I had buried deep inside, the bitterness I had never dared to question. I wasn't silent because I was too wise to answer. I was silent because I had no foundation to stand on anymore. That night, even after my son went to bed, the silence lingered. It followed me into the kitchen, into the living room, and finally into my own room, where I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My house, usually filled with the noise of arguments or distractions, felt unbearably quiet. It wasn't just external silence, it was an inner silence, one that forced me to confront myself. I couldn't escape it. The more I tried to push it away, the louder it became. I realized then that silence can be more terrifying than sound. Words, even angry ones, at least give shape to what you feel. But silence leaves you alone with your thoughts, your doubts, your fears. That night I was left with only one truth. I didn't know why I hated God. My son had uncovered a question that I had never dared to ask myself, and the silence after that question became a mirror, reflecting everything I didn't want to see. The next morning, when I looked at my son, the silence still clung to me. I wanted to tell him something, anything, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. For the first time in my life, words felt cheap, inadequate. And in that void, I sensed something I had long denied. Maybe God wasn't just an illusion. Maybe he was real enough to reach me through the silence I couldn't escape. That thought shook me to my core. Looking back, I see now that the silence wasn't just empty space. It was an invitation. It was God pulling away all my defenses, dismantling my pride, and leaving me face to face with the truth. That uncomfortable silence became the beginning of my awakening. I thought silence meant weakness, but it was the very thing that started to break the chains around my heart. It was the moment I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, God had been there all along, waiting for me to listen. I kept telling myself I was an atheist, that God was nothing more than a myth people clung to when life became unbearable. I repeated it so often that it became like a shield, a mantra I used to keep myself distant from anything that resembled faith. But after that night, after my son's innocent question, the shield began to crack. If God didn't exist, why did I hate him so much? Why did the very mention of his name ignite a fire in me that I couldn't control? That contradiction haunted me. I started noticing the inconsistency in my own words. I had laughed at believers, mocked their prayers, and dismissed their hope as childish illusions. But deep down, my hostility revealed something I had never wanted to admit. I wasn't indifferent to God. I was angry at him, and anger requires an object. You can't truly hate something that doesn't exist. It was as if my entire identity had been built around fighting a shadow. But what if it wasn't a shadow? What if it was real? The more I thought about it, the more restless I became. I told myself that my rejection of God was intellectual, logical, rational. But the truth was far less flattering. My disbelief wasn't rooted in evidence or science. It was rooted in pain, in unanswered questions, in bitterness I had carried since childhood. I hated the idea of God because I felt abandoned, ignored, unseen. And though I tried to disguise that hatred with reason, my son had seen through the mask in a single sentence. Every time I looked at him after that, I felt exposed. He didn't understand the depth of what he had asked, but I did. I felt like a hypocrite, teaching him to reject something I myself couldn't stop fighting against. I had convinced myself that I was raising him in truth, giving him freedom from superstition. But in reality, I was just passing down my anger. My so-called atheism wasn't freeing him. It was binding him to my wounds. The realization cut deeper than I was ready to face. I started to feel trapped in my own contradictions. On one hand, I wanted to prove to myself that God didn't exist, that my hatred was justified, that my silence had been strength. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe my very hatred was evidence of his presence. Why else would I carry so much energy, so much passion, against someone who supposedly wasn't there? It felt like fighting the air and discovering the air was fighting back. The irony of it all gnawed at me. I used to accuse Christians of being blind, of believing without evidence. Yet here I was, driven by emotion, clinging to my disbelief without really knowing why. I accused them of being inconsistent, but I was the one living in contradiction, claiming God wasn't real while shaping my entire worldview around hating him. The hypocrisy was unbearable. I felt like I was collapsing under the weight of my own arguments. At night, when the house was quiet, the inner battle grew louder. I would lie in bed, staring into the dark, trying to convince myself that nothing existed beyond this life. But the silence brought no peace. Instead, it magnified the emptiness inside me, the unanswered questions, the fear that maybe I was wrong. If I was truly certain, shouldn't I feel secure? Why did the thought of God unsettle me so much? Why did my son's simple question leave me trembling inside? I realized that my anger had always been easier than honesty. Anger gave me control. It let me dismiss faith without really confronting my own wounds. But honesty forced me to admit that I didn't know. Honesty made me face the brokenness I had buried under pride. I had built my life on the foundation of rejecting God, but that foundation was cracking. The cracks terrified me, but they also revealed something I had never expected, the possibility that God was real, and I had been running from him. The contradiction ate at me during the day, too. I'd catch myself making sarcastic comments about believers, but the words felt hollow, forced. I noticed that every time I mocked faith, there was a flicker of doubt in my own heart. My son, though young, could see it. His question had opened his eyes, and I feared what he saw in me. He saw a man pretending to be certain, but crumbling on the inside. He saw someone who hated God too much to really be free from him. Looking back now, I see that this inner contradiction was the turning point. It was the moment when my walls began to fall, when my pride started losing its grip. My son's question had exposed the truth. I wasn't as strong as I thought, and my disbelief wasn't as solid as I claimed. I was torn between my pride and my longing, between my anger and my emptiness. And though I didn't know it then, God was already using that tension to draw me closer, one silent contradiction at a time. The question from my son, that simple and innocent question, began to dig deeper than I wanted to admit. It stirred up memories I had long ignored, memories I thought I had buried beneath years of pride and anger. Suddenly, I started to remember arguments from my youth, moments when I mocked classmates who dared to pray before exams, when I laughed at neighbors who carried Bibles to church every Sunday. I had always thought of myself as bold, as enlightened, as someone who refused to bow to superstition. But in truth, those memories carried a bitterness that I couldn't deny anymore. The more I recalled, the clearer the pattern became. My life had not been lived in freedom from God, but in obsession with denying him. Every time the subject came up, I felt compelled to speak, to mock, to argue. It was as if I couldn't resist the urge to attack, even when no one was challenging me. I remembered family dinners turning into heated debates, where I belittled anyone who dared to speak about faith. I thought I was proving my strength, but now I saw it differently. I had been driven by anger, not reason. I could see the smirks on my own face, as if I were watching myself from the outside. The sarcastic tone, the cruel jokes, the rolling of eyes when someone mentioned prayer or miracles. It was almost theatrical, like I needed an audience to applaud my disbelief. But when I replayed those moments in my mind, they no longer felt triumphant. They felt hollow. Every insult, every mocking laugh revealed not confidence, but insecurity. It was as if I had been trying to convince myself more than anyone else. I remembered how I would seek out arguments online, spending hours debating strangers, trying to dismantle their faith with clever words. I thought I was intellectual, logical, the voice of reason in a world blinded by tradition. But when I looked back at those endless discussions, what I really saw was a man desperate to justify his own wounds. My anger wasn't about reason at all. It was about rebellion, about trying to silence the echoes of a God I claimed didn't exist. The irony was painful to admit. Even the jokes I used to tell came back to haunt me. I remembered making fun of Christians at work, imitating the way they prayed, exaggerating their devotion as if it were comedy. My friends laughed, and I basked in their approval. But now those memories filled me with shame. What kind of man builds his sense of worth by tearing down the faith of others? What kind of father passes that legacy to his son? I saw now that I had been molding him in my own bitterness, teaching him not freedom, but resentment. As the memories piled up, I began to notice a disturbing truth. My entire identity was tied to this war against God. My disbelief wasn't passive, it was aggressive. I wasn't simply living without faith, I was living against it, consumed by it. Every insult, every argument, every sarcastic laugh had become a piece of the armor I wore. And without realizing it, that armor had become a prison. I wasn't free at all. I was chained to the very thing I claimed didn't exist. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on me. I thought back to my childhood, to the moment when bitterness first took root. I could recall arguments with my parents, the disappointment, the prayers I thought went unanswered. Somewhere in that pain, I had decided to build my life on denial. But denial had turned into hatred, and hatred had shaped everything about me. It was no longer about truth, it was about holding on to anger, because letting it go felt impossible. My past had written my present. I realized that my past wasn't just filled with arguments. It was filled with moments of silence too. Times when I felt empty, when I longed for something greater, when I almost prayed but stopped myself out of pride. I remembered nights when I stared at the ceiling, wondering if maybe there was something out there, someone listening. But I always silenced those thoughts with louder jokes, harsher words, sharper arguments. Now those memories returned like ghosts, whispering the truth I didn't want to face. As I sat in silence, replaying those scenes, I felt like I was being judged not by others, but by my own conscience. The faces of those I had mocked flashed before me. The conversations I had twisted into ridicule replayed in my mind. And worst of all, I saw my son listening, watching, absorbing. The legacy I was leaving him wasn't strength or wisdom. It was bitterness and contradiction. My past had not only imprisoned me, but was slowly wrapping its chains around him too. That night, as those memories swirled through my mind, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: regret. Real, deep regret that pierced my pride. I could no longer pretend that my life had been lived in freedom. The truth was clear. My life had revolved around hating a God I claimed didn't exist. And now, through the innocent eyes of my child, I was forced to see the emptiness of that path. My past had shaped me, but it didn't have to define me. Still, I wondered, could a man so lost, so bitter, so full of contradictions ever truly change? The days that followed were heavy, but the nights were unbearable. Every time I laid my head on the pillow, I felt as though the room filled with an invisible weight. My son's question would rise from the silence like thunder. "Dad, why do you hate God?" It was not simply a child's curiosity anymore. It was as if the words had been carved into my mind, etched into the deepest parts of me. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, trying to reason my way out of the discomfort, but reason offered no escape. The question lingered like a voice I couldn't shut out. The more I fought it, the louder it seemed to grow. I would close my eyes, desperate for sleep, only to hear that question repeating itself again and again. It was like an echo bouncing off the walls of my conscience, refusing to die down. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, just guilt playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt alive, as if someone was behind it, using the innocent voice of my son to break through my hardened heart. I tried distractions. I scrolled endlessly through my phone, watched television until my eyes burned, drank glass after glass, hoping the heaviness would fade into numbness. But nothing worked. No matter how tired I became, no matter how much I tried to drown the thought, sleep refused to come. It was as though peace had been stolen from me, and I couldn't find it anywhere. The bed that once brought rest had become a battlefield where my pride and my conscience fought relentlessly. There were moments when I almost screamed into the night just to silence it. I buried my head in the pillow, clenched my fists, and whispered angry words into the darkness. Why can't I just forget? Why can't I just move on? But the more I resisted, the clearer the question became. It was simple, innocent, yet devastating. For years, I had prided myself on being unshakable, rational, untouchable by religious nonsense. Yet one question from a child had shattered that illusion completely. At times, I began to wonder if it was God Himself speaking to me, reaching out through the very person I loved most. The thought terrified me. If it was true, then it meant I wasn't running from an idea or a myth. I was running from a real living God. And if that was the case, then my life had been one long rebellion, not against nothing, but against someone. That possibility gnawed at me. It left me restless, pacing the house at night, staring out the window as if the darkness outside might offer an answer. I noticed the toll it began to take on my body. My eyes grew heavy during the day. My patience with my family wore thin. My mind felt clouded, as though I was always carrying a storm inside me. I tried to explain it away, telling myself it was just stress, just exhaustion. But I knew the truth. The sleepless nights were not caused by stress. They were caused by a question I couldn't escape. It was a wound that refused to heal, a seed of doubt planted in the soil of my pride. Some nights, I found myself replaying conversations I had had in the past, the ones where I mocked God or ridiculed believers. But now, they no longer felt like victories. They felt like accusations. My own words haunted me. I could hear myself laughing at Christians, tearing apart their faith with arrogant arguments. And then I would hear my son's small voice again, asking why I hated God. The contradiction screamed louder than ever. How could I devote so much of my life to fighting against something I claimed wasn't real? The silence of the night amplified everything. In the stillness, there was no audience to impress, no debates to win, no laughter from friends to validate me. There was only me, my thoughts, and the unsettling sense that someone was near, pressing me to face the truth. I felt exposed in those hours, as if I were standing before an unseen judge. Every excuse, every clever argument seemed empty and fragile under the weight of that presence. Sleep would not come because my soul was restless. I began to dread the evenings. The sun setting no longer meant rest but torment. I would watch the sky darken and feel a sense of dread rising with it. My family would go to bed and I would stay awake, pretending to work, pretending to read, pretending to be fine. But the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid of being left alone with my thoughts, afraid of facing the silence where the question echoed without mercy. Nights became my enemy, each one a reminder of the turmoil inside me. By the end of the week, I realized something had shifted. I was no longer simply annoyed by the question, I was being broken by it. The sleepless nights had stripped away my defenses, leaving me raw and exposed. I could no longer hide behind my atheism with confidence. Deep down, I knew it. The voice of my son had become the voice of God to me, asking not just a question, but demanding an answer. And until I faced it, there would be no rest, no peace, no escape. The sleepless nights eventually forced me to face what I had been running from all along. I could no longer pretend that the question was harmless, or that it came only from my son's curiosity. Deep inside, I realized that my hatred wasn't directed at a myth, at some empty concept invented by weak people. No, my anger had always been personal, sharp, and alive. I wasn't raging against an illusion. I was raging against someone who was undeniably real. That realization terrified me because it shattered the foundation of my identity as an atheist. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. You don't hate what doesn't exist. You can ignore it, mock it, or laugh at it. But hate is too heavy, too consuming to waste on nothing. My hatred of God had been burning for years, and now I saw it for what it truly was, proof of his existence. It was as though every insult I had spoken, every joke I had made, every ounce of pride I poured into rejecting him now stood as evidence against me. My rebellion wasn't against a fairy tale. It was against a living God who had been there all along. At first, I resisted that thought with everything in me. I told myself it was emotional weakness, just grief, just exhaustion from sleepless nights. But excuses crumbled quickly. The truth had a way of piercing deeper than denial. I found myself standing in front of the mirror one morning, staring at my own face and whispering out loud, "If God isn't real, then who have I been hating all these years?" The words shook me. For the first time in my life, I had cornered myself with a question I couldn't laugh away. The truth was ugly. My entire life had been built around defiance. I had defined myself by what I rejected, by the pride of standing against God. Without realizing it, I had made him the center of my existence, not in worship, but in opposition. My atheism was not neutrality, it was war. And suddenly, I could see that I wasn't strong, I wasn't free, and I wasn't rational. I was a prisoner, consumed by bitterness toward the very one I had been denying. That realization left me trembling. It was like a mirror being held up to my soul, and I didn't like what I saw. I had always prided myself on honesty, on courage, on intellect. But now, the truth revealed that I was a coward. I had been running from God, not because he was false, but because I feared what it would mean if he was true. I feared accountability. I feared surrender. I feared facing the fact that I wasn't in control, that my life belonged to someone greater than me. For years, I had hidden behind clever arguments, but now there was no escape. The anger that once gave me strength now felt hollow. When I thought of all the debates where I ridiculed Christians, I no longer felt victorious. Instead, I felt exposed, as if I had been mocking not just them, but the very God who had given me life. My words came back to me like arrows, piercing the pride that had shielded my heart for so long. For the first time, I saw myself not as enlightened, but as lost, blind, and chained to hatred. And that recognition burned deeper than any insult ever could. I began to wonder why God had allowed me to come this far. Why didn't he silence me sooner? Why didn't he stop me from poisoning my son's heart with bitterness? Yet even in my questions, there was a strange sense that he had been patient with me, waiting for the right moment to confront me with the truth. Perhaps he had even used the innocent voice of my child as the key to break through years of stubbornness. The thought humbled me, though I resisted admitting it. The confrontation with truth wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, relentless, and impossible to escape. It came in the form of memories, in the words of my son, in the sleepless nights where silence turned into conviction. I could no longer deny it. God was real, and my life had been lived in rebellion against him. The weight of that truth was crushing. It was like standing before a mountain I could never climb, a light I could never hide from. The truth demanded an answer, and I could feel that running away was no longer an option. The scariest part wasn't just admitting God was real. It was admitting he had been right all along, and I had been wrong. That was the death of my pride, the collapse of the identity I had built for myself. Who was I, if not the rational, confident atheist who mocked faith? Who was I if God was true, and I was just a stubborn, angry man who spent his life denying him? The confrontation with truth stripped me bare, leaving me with nothing to hide behind, nothing to cling to, except the very God I had rejected. By the end of that week, I knew something had changed forever. I could no longer look at myself the same way. The truth was clear, sharp, undeniable. My hatred had been proof, my rebellion had been confession, and my life had been a war against the very creator I denied. I stood at a crossroads, trembling. For the first time in my life, I had to make a choice. Not whether God was real, but whether I would keep rejecting him or finally surrender to the truth that had pursued me all along. I remember sitting alone in the dark one night, trying to hold everything inside. My pride told me to stay strong, to keep reasoning, to fight back against the idea of surrendering. I repeated old arguments in my head, clung to the words I had used for years. Faith is weakness. God is a lie. Life is meaningless. But those phrases no longer carried any power. They sounded empty, fragile, like broken tools in the hands of someone desperate to fix something far beyond repair. My heart was too heavy, and the walls I had built around it began to crack. The more I fought, the more exhausted I became. Pride demanded I keep standing, but my soul was collapsing under the weight of truth. I tried to drown it out with distractions, music, television, anything to numb the voice echoing inside me. Yet every attempt only deepened the silence afterward, and in that silence, the truth roared louder. I realized I wasn't running toward anything anymore. I was only running from God. And he wasn't chasing me with anger, but with a love that was breaking me down. Tears came unexpectedly. I hadn't cried in years. I had prided myself on being strong, on keeping emotions buried, on never showing weakness. But suddenly, my chest ached, and tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. It wasn't just sadness. It was the crushing weight of guilt, regret, and the realization that I had been wrong my entire life. The more I tried to hold them back, the harder the tears fell. It was as if my soul was finally bleeding after being locked in chains for too long. I whispered into the dark, almost afraid to hear my own voice. God, if you're real, why didn't you just leave me alone? My words trembled, broken by sobs. Deep inside, I already knew the answer. He hadn't left me because he loved me, even when I hated him. He hadn't abandoned me because he still had a plan for my life, even when I rejected him. That thought tore me apart. For years, I cursed him, denied him, mocked him, yet he still pursued me. That realization shattered what was left of my pride. Inside me, there was a war. One side screamed that surrender was weakness, that I would lose myself, that I would be nothing. The other side whispered that surrender was the only way to live, the only path to freedom, the only hope for peace. I felt trapped between two voices, the pride that had defined me and the love that was calling me. Every breath was heavy with conflict. I wanted to resist, but resistance felt like slowly suffocating in my own bitterness. The memories of my son's words returned, piercing my heart. Dad, why do you hate God? That innocent question now echoed like a divine invitation, a call I couldn't ignore. I realized that the real question wasn't why I hated God, but whether I was ready to stop, whether I was willing to let go of the chains I had forged myself and accept the truth I had fought against. My son's words were no accident. They were the spark that set this fire inside me, burning everything false until only the truth remained. The tears wouldn't stop. I found myself on my knees, though I hadn't intended to kneel. It was as if the weight inside me pushed me down, forcing me to a place I had never been before. Humility. My fists clenched, my jaw tightened, but my heart was breaking open. I didn't have the courage to pray, not yet. The words wouldn't form. But in my brokenness, in my sobbing, I realized that my silence itself was a cry, one that God had already heard. For the first time in years, I stopped fighting. Just for a moment, I let the weight fall from my shoulders. I didn't have answers, I didn't have strength, I didn't even have words, but I had nothing left to hide behind. And in that moment of emptiness, something strange happened. I felt the faintest sense of peace, like a whisper brushing against the chaos inside me. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but it was real, and that terrified me even more than the darkness had. Pride still screamed in the background, telling me to get up, to push it all away, to rebuild the walls. But the brokenness in me had gone too deep. I couldn't go back to who I was before. The struggle between pride and surrender became unbearable until I realized that surrender wasn't death. It was the only way to truly live. Tears streaming, hands shaking, I finally admitted to myself, I can't do this on my own anymore. That confession was small, but it was the beginning of everything. In that moment, I understood why people called it surrender, not defeat. I hadn't lost myself. I had let go of chains I never should have carried. The battle inside me wasn't over yet, but the walls of pride were crumbling. For the first time, my heart began to see the possibility of grace. And though I was still trembling, still unsure, I felt something shift inside me. The fight wasn't between me and nothing. It was between me and God. And He was winning, not with force, but with love. I sat there on the floor, my face buried in my hands, and for the first time in years, I let myself break. The tears wouldn't stop, and I didn't try to stop them anymore. It felt strange, almost foreign, to cry like that. I had built an image of myself as strong, unshakable above all this emotional weakness. But at that moment, the walls crumbled. My pride was gone, and all that remained was a broken man who had lived too long in denial. I saw it clearly. I had wasted years fighting against God, years filled with bitterness and anger that only deepened my pain. The silence around me wasn't empty anymore. In the past, silence had been torture, a void filled with my own restless thoughts. But now, in that room, the silence felt different. It wasn't mocking me, it was listening. I can't explain how I knew, but I felt like God Himself was there, not with judgment, not with condemnation, but with a presence I couldn't ignore. I had told myself He didn't exist. I had shouted it to the world, but deep down I had always known. And now, the truth was undeniable. I whispered something I had never thought I would say. My voice trembled, my throat tightened, but the words slipped out. God, I'm sorry. That was it. 2 words, fragile and broken, but they carried years of anger, pride, and rebellion behind them. I wasn't reciting a prayer. I wasn't following a script. I was just pouring out the first honest thing that had come from my heart in a very long time. And even though the words were weak, I felt like heaven heard me. The weight on my chest seemed to lift a little. I still didn't understand everything. I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know how to fix the mess I had made of my life. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that I had finally stopped running. For the first time, I wasn't fighting God anymore. I was admitting the truth, that I needed Him, that I couldn't go on like this. Memories of the past flooded my mind. Moments when I laughed at Christians, mocked them, belittled their faith. I saw myself sneering, so confident in my superiority, so blind to the emptiness inside. And now here I was, on my knees, broken and undone. The irony was painful, but at the same time, it was freeing. Because I realized that God had seen all of that, every insult, every curse, every ounce of hatred, and He was still here with me. That kind of love broke me even more. I cried harder, not from anger this time, but from a strange mixture of regret and relief. Regret for the years I had wasted in darkness. Relief that even after all that, I wasn't too far gone. My tears felt like cleansing water, washing away layers of pride and denial that had buried me for so long. I had always thought surrender would feel like defeat, but it didn't. It felt like release, like stepping out of a prison I hadn't even realized I was trapped in. For years I thought admitting weakness would destroy me, but in that moment, admitting weakness saved me. My strength had failed me, my pride had failed me, my logic had failed me. All I had left was brokenness, and strangely that was enough, because it was in my brokenness that God finally reached me. I couldn't stand on my own anymore, and maybe that was the point. Maybe I was never meant to. I whispered again, barely audible. I can't do this without you. Those words terrified me because they meant I was finally letting go of control. But they also brought peace, a peace I had never felt before. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, steady, like a hand resting on my shoulder in the darkness. I didn't see a vision, I didn't hear a voice, but I knew God was near, and He wasn't pushing me away, He was welcoming me. The years of denial suddenly looked so small compared to this moment. All the debates, the arguments, the jokes, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I was no longer hiding, no longer pretending. I was finally being honest with myself and with God. And honesty brought a freedom I hadn't known was possible. It was as if a door had been opened and light was beginning to seep in. By the end of that night, I was exhausted, my eyes swollen from crying, my heart raw from everything I had confessed in silence. But even in my exhaustion, I felt something new, hope, fragile, small, almost delicate, but real. I had taken the first step towards surrender, and though I didn't know what the road ahead would look like, I knew one thing. I wasn't walking it alone anymore. God had found me in my brokenness, and for the first time, I was ready to let Him lead. I knelt there, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to pray, but my heart was too full to stay silent. I didn't try to craft perfect words. I didn't try to sound religious. I just spoke as if speaking to someone who had always been listening. My voice cracked as I whispered, "God, forgive me." That was all I could manage at first. Simple words, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. For years I had denied Him, rejected Him, cursed Him. And yet, in that moment, I believed, truly believed, that He heard me. It was strange how natural it felt once I began. The words flowed like water from a broken dam. I confessed my anger, my pride, my mocking laughter, my rebellion. I admitted the emptiness, the nights of despair, the restless thoughts I had hidden from everyone. I didn't hold anything back. For the first time, I wasn't trying to argue, wasn't trying to justify myself. I was laying my heart bare. And the more I spoke, the lighter I felt, as if every confession lifted a stone I had been carrying for far too long. I had expected judgment. I had expected rejection. But what I felt instead was something I had never known before: peace. It came quietly, gently, but undeniably. It wasn't the shallow peace I had once claimed through logic or pride. It wasn't the temporary distraction of pleasure or success. It was deeper, richer, something that touched the very core of my being. It wrapped around me like an embrace, steady and unshakable, and for the first time in my life I felt safe. My tears returned, but these weren't tears of despair, they were tears of healing. I realized that God had not only been listening, He had been waiting for me to finally stop running, to finally surrender. And when I did, He didn't meet me with anger, but with mercy. I had mocked Him, hated Him, denied Him, and yet here He was, giving me peace instead of punishment. That realization broke me even more, but in the best possible way. I whispered again, this time with more courage, "Thank you." 2 small words, but they came from the deepest place inside me. Gratitude poured out of me, not because everything in my life suddenly made sense, not because my problems had vanished, but because I was no longer alone. I knew with a certainty that defied explanation that God was with me. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The room didn't change, but I did. The same 4 walls surrounded me. The same shadows filled the corners, but everything felt different. The emptiness that had haunted me for years was gone, replaced by a quiet fullness I had never experienced. I felt held, supported, loved. It was as if the silence itself was alive now, filled with God's presence. And in that presence, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the torment lost their grip. I stayed there for a long time, just breathing, just resting in that peace. My thoughts slowed down, the chaos in my mind quieted. For once, I didn't need answers. I didn't need explanations. I didn't need to prove anything. I was simply there with Him, and it was enough. The simplicity of it stunned me. After years of complicated debates and endless arguments, it all came down to this: a broken man whispering to his Creator and finding peace. It struck me that this was what I had been searching for all along. I had chased it in philosophy, in mocking others, in proving myself right. I had tried to fill the void with pride and control. But the peace I longed for had never been found there. It had only been waiting for me to surrender. And when I finally did, it came rushing in, like sunlight breaking through years of clouds. I thought about the people I had mocked, the believers I had insulted. I realized now that what I saw in them, that joy and calm I couldn't explain, wasn't weakness. It was this peace. It was God in them, the same God who was now meeting me in my brokenness. I wished I had seen it sooner, but I was grateful I could see it now. I was grateful that despite everything, God hadn't given up on me. That night, I went to sleep differently than I had in years. No tormenting thoughts, no restless anger, no war inside my head, just peace, pure, unshakable peace. I didn't know what tomorrow would hold. I didn't know how to explain this to anyone, but I knew one thing. I had encountered God, and nothing would ever be the same again. Today, when I look back, I see clearly that it all started with one innocent question from my son, a simple question that cut through the walls I had built, exposing the truth I had been running from for so long. Dad, why do you hate God? Those words became the turning point of my life. What once felt like a blow has now become a blessing. I realize now that God used the pure voice of a child to reach a hardened heart like mine, to break the pride I thought was unshakable. I often tell people that I was once a proud atheist, someone who mocked faith and ridiculed those who believed. I wore my arrogance like armor, pretending that logic and reason made me stronger than others. But inside, I was crumbling. I was empty, restless, and bitter. My life was defined by denial, but denial never gave me peace. It only kept me in chains, and it took the honesty of my little boy to make me face the prison I had built for myself. Now, when I speak, I don't speak with pride anymore. I speak with gratitude. Gratitude that God didn't give up on me. Gratitude that He met me in my brokenness. Gratitude that His mercy was bigger than my rebellion. The irony is not lost on me. I who once mocked testimonies am now giving mine. I who once laughed at prayers now find myself speaking to God daily. And what I once called weakness, I now know to be the greatest strength of all: surrender to Him. My son probably doesn't fully understand the impact his words had on me, but I will never forget them. I tell him now that God used him, even as a child, to bring light into his father's darkness. It humbles me to think that God can work through anyone, even the smallest voice, to accomplish His plans. And it gives me hope that my story, my testimony, can be used in the same way, to reach others who are where I once was, trapped in pride and unbelief. When I share my story, I don't sugarcoat it. I admit the anger, the hatred, the mocking words I once used. I admit the emptiness I carried, the restless nights, the hypocrisy of claiming God didn't exist while living as if I hated Him. I lay it all bare because that's where grace shines brightest. People don't need to hear about a perfect life. They need to hear how God transforms broken ones. And I am living proof that no heart is too hard for Him to soften. I used to think testimonies were emotional tricks, just stories told to manipulate feelings, but now I understand. A true testimony is power. It is evidence of a God who is real, alive, and active in the world today. When I tell my story, I'm not trying to argue or win debates. I'm simply bearing witness to what happened to me. No argument could have convinced me before, but God Himself encountered me, and that is undeniable. There are still moments of struggle, times when doubts whisper or when old habits try to resurface. But the difference now is that I don't face them alone. The peace I found that night has never left me, and every day I see it confirmed in small ways. Through answered prayers, through restored relationships, through the calm in my heart. I no longer need to carry the burden of proving or disproving God. I know Him now, personally, and that changes everything. My family sees the difference too. My wife says I laugh more, that I listen more, that I carry myself differently. My son, the one whose questions started it all, sometimes asks me about God now, not in challenge, but in curiosity. And I get to tell him, not from books or arguments, but from my own life, God is real, God is good, and God is love. I want my son to grow up not with the bitterness I carried, but with the peace I found. I used to believe I had to hold control, that surrender was weakness. But now I know the opposite is true. Surrender brought freedom. Surrender brought healing. Surrender gave me back my life. That is why I speak wherever I can, because there are countless others like me, hiding behind pride, drowning in emptiness, mocking what they secretly long for. If my story can spark even a flicker of hope in someone else, then it is worth sharing again and again. So yes, I was once the man who mocked God, who hated him, who claimed he was nothing but an illusion. But now I stand as a witness of his grace. I can't explain everything, I can't answer every question, but I can tell you this. I was blind, and now I see. I was empty, and now I am full. I was restless, and now I have peace. And all of it began with a single question from the lips of a child, God's gentle way of leading me home.